Now let's look at the third move, h4. With this move, white is intending to play h5 and create a pawn lever h5 against g6. As a rule of thumb, when your opponent tries to create a pawn lever which you cannot resolve yourself, for example, if white plays h5 and has the pawn lever h5 against g6, black cannot take on h5 because it would ruin his pawn structure. But advancing to g5 is also a little bit tricky because white might later on play f4. So the best black could do would be to just let it stand on h5 and g6 and wait until white decides to either play h6 or take on g6. This explains why I suggest to avoid it right from the start and instead play h5. Now white has the same possibilities as after second move g6, but the moves h4 and h5 are already included. Sometimes this makes a difference. Let's start by looking at b4. Here, as in the main line, I suggest we go bishop to g7, attack the rook on a1, and white has two options to play c3 or knight c3. After c3, which threatens to take on c5 and then play d4, protecting the pawn on c5, I suggest to play d5, as in the main line, and the inclusion of h4 and h5 doesn't make much of a difference. So after bishop to g7, there's also knight c3. Again, white is threatening to take on c5 and then play d4 to protect c5. Therefore, I suggest to play d6 and protect c5. Now white has several possibilities to develop the bishop on f1. He can go to g2, to e2 or to b5 as in the main line. I will just look at the bishop e2, knight f3 setup. Knight f3, we play knight c6 and go for the dark square control. We might take on b4, therefore white will most likely play rook b1. And in the main line I suggested to play e6, knight ge7. But in this case, with the pawns on h4 and h5, the g4 square is rather weak. So I suggest we opt for knight f6 to g4, and white doesn't have the move h3 to kick away our knight. That's why in the current position I suggest to play knight f6. And after bishop e2, castle short. Black then can play either knight d4, knight g4, maybe even b6, bishop to b7, with an at least equal game. After h5, there's also bishop c4. Here I suggest to play bishop to g7, knight c3, knight c6, and after d3, I had mentioned that the plan with e6 and d5 is pretty strong. But instead of playing e6 in this position, I suggest to play knight f6. And later on, black can castle, play either e6, d5, or he can play a6, b5. But again, the square g4 is a nice outpost for the knight. The third option after h5 is d4. And it's those forcing lines where the inclusion of h4 and h5 is most apparent. We have to follow our rule of thumb whenever white plays d4 and he has not played c3. Before that, we take on d4. Now again, white has two options. He can take on d4 or he can play with c3. If white takes on d4 with a queen, he attacks the rook on h8 and we have to play knight f6. Now e5 as in the main line does not work because of knight c6, but black is at the moment threatening to play knight c6 and attack the queen on d4. So white has to play bishop b5 to stop knight c6. We play a6 to attack the bishop, and if the bishop retreats to a4, we can go b5 followed by knight c6. This means white has to play e5 now. We take on b5, white has to take on f6, and in this position without the inclusion of h4, h5, there were two possibilities for black, either to play e6 or to play knight c6. Yet in this position there's only one move which works, which is knight c6. Because e6 doesn't work because of bishop g5, which protects the f6 pawn, and black doesn't have the move h7, h6, which would kick back the bishop from g5. So after e takes f6, black has to play knight c6, queen e3, and now we play e6. With a very nice position. We are threatening to take on f6, and white has the same problems as in the main line. I would like to mention that instead of e6, you might wonder why not play bishop h6 in this position, but this is a blunder. White takes on e7, and black has two options. He can go queen c7 or queen a5 check. On queen c7, white plays queen c3, and he's attacking the rook on h8, which means white is winning in this position. Instead, after f takes e7, if black plays queen a5 check, white plays queen c3. And if we take on c1, white has the strong move b4. With a double attack, b takes a5 and queen takes h8. So remember to play e6 after queen e3. Now let's return to the position after c takes d4. White could also play the delayed Mora gambit once more, with fifth move c3. Again we take on c3, knight takes c3, and we play bishop to g7. Now white plays the same setup as in the Mora gambit, with bishop c4 and knight f3. Again we can go knight f6 in this position, and the most testing move once more is e5. We go knight g4, and in this position the trick with bishop takes f7 check doesn't work because the knight on g4 is protected. But white can go for bishop f4. And black needs to remember not to take on e5 as in the main line, because after knight takes e5, white captures on e5, knight takes on e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5. Now white can take on f7, and I had mentioned that king takes f7, queen d5 check is very dangerous for black, but after king f8, the inclusion of the moves h4 and h5 favor white because the g6 pawn is undefended and white can just take it. This means that after bishop f4, black should not take on e5 but castle instead. White then can play a move like queen to e2 to protect the e5 pawn. Yet this is not a better version for white, because he cannot play the move h3 to kick away the problematic knight from g4, which is always threatening the e5 pawn. And black should be clearly better. This concludes our analysis on the third move h4.